I want to tell you about the book that I've written and appeared this year. But let me start saying a few words about why I wrote this book and the circumstances under which I wrote it. As Nir pointed out, I was the director of a research center called the Center for the Study of Rationality. It's about rationality, but it's much broader. It's about decision making. It's an interdisciplinary center that accommodates people from different disciplines, starting with economics and business, but also math, psychology, computer science, biology, law, and I might have sociology, and I might have philosophy. And all these people are doing research in their own field, but they have one common issue, which is one common topic that they're interested in, which is decision making. When I served as the director of the center, I had lots of opportunity to talk with people and learn from people coming from different disciplines. I had some collaboration and some joint papers with these people. And at the end of my term as the director, I decided I want to put everything that I have in mind about decision making and rationality and the way I was influenced by my colleague, and decided to write this book. And while thinking very seriously about rationality, about decision making, I realized that there is one aspect in decision making that is very much overlooked by much of these disciplines, even psychology, and this is the role of emotions in decision making. And one of the purpose of writing this book was to highlight, based on my research, because I started already doing research in the field, in understanding emotions better and the way they affect our decision making, and also reflecting on these other people who worked on it, some of them in my center, some of them outside the center in various places in the world. And so that was the purpose of writing the book. And many of you took courses in economics, and I bet none of you have heard I was an economics student, I didn't hear the word emotions at all through my studentship career in economics. And I bet most of you haven't heard this word, because most of us think that this belongs to a different territory. That's maybe neuroscience, maybe psychology. It doesn't belong to economics, it doesn't belong to business. And this perception is being changed now. And I wrote the book. Of course, I was a little bit concerned about the way my colleagues in economics will think about it or will treat it, because again, this was the way I interpret it. This word was pretty much a taboo in the profession. So let me tell you a little bit about the process. I wrote it in Hebrew first, and then I translated when it appeared to be quite successful in Israel. I translated it myself to English, and then there was a publisher in Germany that asked to publish it, and now it appears also in Germany. And there are three other publishers that are going to come up with a book, big publishers that are going to come up with a book, one of them in China, in Japan, and in Turkey. I speak English, I speak German, so I could give my inputs to these translation. In fact, one of them I did myself. Of course, I speak Hebrew, but I won't have anything to say about the way I'm translated in these other languages. But when I finished the book, as I told you, because emotions seemed to be a rather unfamiliar or a topic that is not really discussed within economists, it was important to me to know what people in my profession is saying. And Through the publisher, I was very lucky to actually get endorsement that appear in the book by 8 Nobel laureates, George Akerlof, Ken Arrow, Robert Aumann, Bob Lucas, Eric Muskin, Roger Myerson, Alvin Roth, which Neil knows personally also, and Vernon Smith, and also by people who wrote other popular books on decision making to some extent, not all of them actually. Dana Rieli, Barry Nailboff, Sylvia Nassar, who wrote Beautiful Mind, and Larry Summer, who was the former Secretary of Finance in the US and the president of Harvard University. So if you are interested in economics and you worry that emotions really don't belong there, then I hope these names will change your mind about reading it. And when I started thinking about it, I noticed that the first thing to do was to address 2 conventional wisdoms about emotions and rationality that are very widespread. In fact, until several decades ago, they were even widespread among scientists. Now scientists realize that they are wrong, they're false, but still most of the general public, and by the way, this book is meant for general public. This is not a pure academic book. It's meant for general readers. Among the general public, this is really still very much true conventional wisdom. One of them is that what we have in the brain are 2 separate boxes, one that is responsible for our rational decision making and the other one which is responsible for our emotional decision making. And they're constantly fighting, okay? And eventually one of these boxes takes over, the other one caves in, and this is how we make the decision, okay? If it's the right-hand box that won, then we make a rational decision. If it's the left-hand one, then we make an emotional decision. Okay, this is very wrong. Okay, we don't have 2 boxes in the brain, and we can't really separate emotions from analysis or reasoning. There are places in which are more typical to process emotions, and I'm going to talk about it. But it's very hard to separate these areas. That's one thing. And the other thing, which is even more important, is that our rational being and our emotional being are constantly in discussion, constantly exchanging information, constantly deliberating, working really, really together in quite coherently. So if at all there is some interaction between these 2 boxes, assuming we want to keep this this description, then obviously they are very much intermingled. Okay. The reason is that basically even the most material decision making eventually involve an emotional reaction. When we enter the supermarket and we face 2 products in front of us and we eventually put our hand on one of them, the final trigger is emotional. The final trigger is take place after a process in which we analyze things. We ask questions, we look at numbers, and we analyze it, and we look back and think about the consequences and things like that. This is analytical, but eventually the last trigger is emotional. Okay, so this is one conventional wisdom. The other conventional wisdom is about how emotions affect our decision making, and most of us believe that we would have been able to do better decisions without emotions, especially when these decisions involve our involve financial or economic decisions. This is also wrong. Okay, emotions not only it's not only the case that they don't generally destroy or reduce the quality of our decision making. Even the contrary, in most cases, they help us, they facilitate our decision making. Okay? And we would have been, in spite of our craving to be like Mr. Spock, if you remember, the person who could simply turn off his emotional being and make decisions solely by logic and reasoning, we would have been a very, very bad decision maker if we had this ability, or if we turned off our emotional being. One startling evidence about it, is written in a wonderful book by Antonio Damasio, who is neuroscience, who basically tell us a lot about the neurology of emotions. And he talks about a very famous incident of a train worker in the States at the end of the 19th century who got injured while working on the train tracks. And he was actually, he was hit in the front one, and an object came through his front and craving a hole of that size. And nevertheless, he survived it. He survived it and lived about 20 years afterwards. The accident didn't actually do anything to his reasoning ability, to his analytic skills. He could do calculation. He could do all sorts of complicated stuff that he used to do before. But emotionally and socially, his life were completely ruined. Okay? One experiment, once he was discovered, scientists started to implement all sorts of decision-making experiments of him. And one of the most startling phenomena is that when you give this person an opportunity to make decisions, they simply can't make the decision. Okay? If you put two fruits, the same fruit, if you put two apples in front of them, they would randomly take one. But if you put an apple and an orange, he would stare at it for 15 minutes, not being able to make a decision. And the way his life was ruined was because of his inability to deal properly with his emotion. For instance, he couldn't wake up in the morning and do the basic thing that all of us are doing, preparing ourselves to go to work. He understood that going to work is essential for his well-being. He could explain why it's essential for his well-being, but he didn't have this trigger, emotional trigger, intrinsic trigger that made him do so. Okay, so he lost his job, he lost his family, and was a miserable person, in spite of the fact that nothing in his analytical skill was damaged. Okay. So why isn't it correct? How do emotions facilitate and help us in decision making? So let me first say that in my book I make distinction between two types of emotions. Ones which I call social emotions. These are emotions, or interactive emotions. These are emotions that we experience only when we interact with someone else. Okay? If we are angry, we have to be angry at somebody. Okay? If we love somebody or feel empathy to somebody, it has to be somebody to whom we feel this emotion, to whom we experience this emotional reaction. These are, so we're talking about empathy, love, embarrassment is an interactive emotion, anger, of course, but there are also emotions which I call autonomous emotions that you don't require any interaction at all, like, for instance, fear. We can experience fear from somebody, but it's not necessary. We can experience fear from diseases, from accidents, from whatever, right? So fear, happiness, sorrow, these are emotions that I call autonomous. And most of the book is actually talking about the advantages of our interactive emotion. And let me give you one example, so actually two examples, about how anger can serve us. And these are based on experiments that have been done several decades ago in the US. In one of these experiments, subjects were brought to the lab to negotiate division of sums of money. Okay? They were divided into pairs. They were given some money. Some sort of asymmetry was created so as not to get them focused on some focal point of dividing it 50-50. And they were brought to the lab to negotiate about how to divide these monies. But before they were taken into the lab, some of them were induced to be slightly more angry than the rest. How do you make people synthetically more angry? There are two techniques that are used. One of them is to let them wait in front of the lab an extra hour before you bring them in. This will definitely make them pissed off, but I don't like this technique. There are another technique that psychology is used very often, and some of my colleagues at the Hebrew University do, which is asking them to write down in a very detailed way an annoying experience that they had, let's say, in the last 2 or 3 years. Okay, while they write it down, you can look at the face and see how emotionally arousal they are, how angry they become while writing this stuff. So some of them were induced by this technique to be angry more than the others. And what these researchers found, which is startling, I think, but it says a lot about the role of emotions in making us more rational. What they found out is that those people who entered the lab with a higher level of anger also left the lab with a higher level of money. Okay? So anger actually bought money, bought them something. Okay? And I'm going to tell you a little bit later about how comes that those people did better in negotiation. Okay? Another experiment that was carried out around the same time dealt not with negotiations, but with debating. Debating is when people try to convince each other about some political issue or ideological issue and bring arguments. Okay? It's not about negotiations, it's not about dividing anything, it's about convincing. Okay? And they use the same technique to make some people more angry than the other. And what they found out, and then they wrote down all the argument that people are making during their debate. And what they found out that those people who were slightly more angry, and I stress slightly because I don't want to motivate you now to really go back home and ask yourself, how do I make myself mad about other people, right? Tuning is the main thing here. But anyhow, those people who were slightly more angry than the rest were found to be able to distinguish better between relevant argument and irrelevant argument. To some extent, this is less surprising than what I told you before, because we know that anger raises the level of adrenaline in our body. It makes us more alert. It motivates us. When we are angry, we want to change the situation. We are motivated in doing stuff. And eventually this comes out to, this boils down to something helpful for us. Okay? So much of the discussion in the book is going through different types of emotional reactions and asking myself to what extent they help us and how this the ability for them to be helpful to us is actually consistent with what we know in economic theory. Okay, all that I have in the book is consistent. It's not contradicting economic theory. It's actually confirming economic theory, but reinterpreting some of the concepts and notions that we have in economic theory. Okay. So for instance, one very important concept that can explain a lot why people are served well by being a little bit angry is the concept of commitment. This is an old concept due to Thomas Schelling that roughly says that sometimes in strategic interactions we get an advantage by tying our hands behind our back. Reducing our opportunities could serve us, okay? And one of the examples I heard from a friend of mine who is a historian concerned the Roman legions that were chasing the German tribes over the Rhine. They used to burn the bridges over the Rhine. Okay, burning the bridges is reducing your opportunities, is doing something that is irreversible to some extent. But this is an action that made them better off because it could signal their enemies that there is only one way they can go now, right? There's no way back for them, which influenced, of course, the behavior of the other party. Okay? So now let me go back to anger and describe to you a hypothetical scenario that might give you a little bit of insight about why anger could serve us in relation to this idea of commitment. Okay? So I want you to think about a situation in which you come back from a conference or vacation and you're notified at the airport that your flight was canceled. It happened to all of us, I guess, or most of us, many of us, I would say. When I tell it to my kids, they say, to my students, undergrad students, they say, wonderful, and another day in a hotel. But for most of us, these are bad news, okay? And what I want you to do is to go through two different scenarios and try to speculate about the emotional reaction that you'll have in these two different scenarios, whether you'll have the same emotional reaction in these two scenarios. In scenario A, you look around yourself and you basically realize that people are very indifferent about these news. They don't seem to care much about the fact that they are asked to report a day later at the airport. They are announcing that buses are waiting outside to take you to the hotel. And your overall insight is that it's a done deal. Nothing would happen. Nothing could change. Okay? I assume that in this situation, under this scenario, you won't be really, anger would not be the characteristic, would not be the right emotion to characterize your mental state. Maybe frustration, maybe sorrow about the fact that you missed your spouse's birthday or your girlfriend's birthday, but not anger. Okay? Now I want to take you through scenario B, which starts very much the same, but develops differently. And in scenario B, you come across an acquaintance, and he tells you, listen, Neil, I went to the airline desk, and in a very assertive and determined way, I explained them that I'm not going to take this treatment. That I'm expecting them to serve me with some alternative. And I told them, again, I had to raise a little bit my voice for doing it, but I told them that if they don't do it, I'm going to sue the company. And believe it or not, they rerouted me now to a different flight, and I'm going to be back home in a few hours. In this scenario, scenario B, I bet you'll be much more angry than in scenario A. You'll be angry. You are likely to go yourself to the desk of the airline and ask for a similar treatment, maybe raise your voice a little bit. It's not that you will imitate being angry. If I could measure, and I'll tell you later about how we do it in the lab, you measure your emotional reaction, I would be able to see that, for instance, your level of adrenaline went up. And the reason why emotional reaction will be so different between scenario A and scenario B is that in scenario B, you encounter an opportunity which was not there in scenario A. Okay? Because you just heard that this guy who was angry were treated better. Okay? And much of our emotional reaction, and primarily and potentially almost only in case of interactive emotion, when we talk about interactive emotions, are synthesized this way. I'm calling it synthesizing is a little bit of unfair way, but are prone or are affected by motivation. Okay, this is actually an interesting phenomenon because if you think about the recent contribution, the recent years, the contribution of behavioral economics was in primarily one direction, thinking about how emotions affect rational behavior or distorting rational behavior. The example that I just gave you, if you believe it, is about how rationality affects our emotion. It's basically about the fact that incentives kick back to affect our emotional state of mind. Okay? Let me give you another example that I've been the chairman for several years of the economics department at the Hebrew University, and one of the things I put some effort in was something that you Brits don't know about because you have these double examination, or the exams are going through two different individuals. In Israel, it's very common for students to appeal on their grades, on their marks. And there are very elaborate appealing procedures. And appealing is really a tough issue in Israel because it really invokes very bad emotions on the part of the students. This is where you get students to cry, to be extremely angry. In one time, even we had to remove a student with an ambulance because she fainted. During this negotiation, vis-a-vis the instructor, okay, or vis-a-vis the TA, and we started to experiment with different regimes and also inquire with other universities that have different regime. And one insight that we converged to is that the most liberal you make the procedure, the less students are satisfied at the end of the year. Okay? The most rigid you make it, the more they are satisfied. If you make it a very liberal system, you can appeal and then appeal against the appeal and then write a letter to the provost and the president. This is where all these bad feelings coming out. But when you tell them, listen, this is only one out of many exams that you'll go through in your career here as a student, and you just need to believe that the professor didn't intentionally try to reduce your grade, and then you can expect that this mistake here will be washed away with another mistake, in which will be in your favor. Okay? If we couldn't get that close to this regime in which they are not allowed to appeal at all, but the closer we got there, the more satisfied the students were. And again, the reason for it is some of these emotional reactions are being incentivized. Okay? Incentives affect these emotional state of mind. So let me tell you about an experiment that we published several, I think 2 or 3 years ago at a journal called Neuroscience, Social Neuroscience, that is focusing on research in neuroscience that concerns social behavior. What we wanted to do is to highlight. What I wanted to do is to highlight this aspect that emotions can be incentivized. that incentives and reasoning about incentive, let's call it rationality, can affect emotions. Not only emotion can affect rationality, but also rationality can affect emotion. So what we did, we used a machine called skin conductance. Skin conductance is a machine that can actually read emotional reactions, okay? It's based on reading physiological signals from the body, basically the conductance of the skin. We know that people are experience an emotional reaction, they tend to sweat more, and their level of conductance in the body increases. And also the heartbeats, and there's a very elaborate procedure when to measure these signals. And for decades now, psychologists use this machine together with a battery of questionnaire that are completely orthogonal to the strategic environment that they create in the lab. And these two things allow them to not only identify what kind of emotion the person is experiencing, whether it's anger or fear or empathy or whatever, but also the level of the emotional reaction. And we wanted, as I said, to see whether we can incentivize people to become emotional and become emotional to specific emotions, okay? So we created basically 3 treatments. We used, I won't get into too much details, but roughly we created a strategic situation in which 2 individuals interacted, and we connected one of them to the skin conductance. And we told this person in treatment 1, we have a way to measure your anger due to unsatisfying behavior on your counterpart. Okay, we can actually measure how angry you are about the way he's treating you. And if we find, and the more angry you're going to be, the more we are going to compensate you. In treatment B, we said the same, but not with respect to anger, but rather with respect to happiness. The more happy you're going to be by the way your counterpart is treating you, the more we are going to reward you. And treatment 3 was basically neutral. There was no rewards whatsoever. It was a neutral environment. And what we found out is that the emotional reaction, the objective emotional reaction, read through the skin conductors, was way, way higher at the anger group than the one we measured in the 2 other treatments. The one in the happy group was somewhat higher than the control group, but the difference there was not significant. The only difference which was significant is the level of anger that people experience. The emotional reaction in the anger group compared with the 2 other groups. Okay, so this was an evidence that that let us believe that people can use emotion strategically, can be motivated to be emotional. Okay, and the question of why did the reaction was so much more pronounced when it was about anger and not about happiness is by itself an interesting question. Well, there could be several answers to it. One of them could be simply a ceiling effect, that we are potentially, it would have been nice if we could, by means of small incentives, make people happy. I mean, I'm sure government have used it, put a lot of resources into this if this was the case. And unfortunately, this is not the case. Okay? And potentially one reason that it's not the case is that it's not the case because it's apparently much easier to incentivize people to be angry than incentivizing them to be happy. And potentially this is because anger is, from evolutionary point of view, is a much more useful emotion than happiness. As I said before, anger is get us to do stuff. When we are angry, we are motivated, we are alert. We want to do stuff to change the situation, okay? To be vengeance against somebody. That requires a lot of, a lot of motivation. When we are happy, we tend to feel things are fine. Why should we care so much about what happened? We'd rather go to the beach. But this is still at the level of speculation, okay? So this is one of the experiments that we did. And let me tell you that behind the general reader's book that I'm telling you about, there is a more serious scientific paper which is called Mental Equilibrium and Strategic Emotions. This is basically a game theoretic paper that tries to incorporate, that actually attempts to incorporate emotions as part of an equilibrium concept. And it will appear soon in Management Science. And once I had this, while writing this theory paper, I also thought about ways of checking some of the assumptions that lie behind this model. And one of them, indeed, is the idea that we can incentivize ourselves or through other people to be emotional. There is another assumption which is crucial for the idea of rational emotions, and this is the assumption that we are capable, at least to some degree, to recognize the emotional state of the other person. Remember, I told you about the role of commitment in generating benefits to us in the state of mind. Maybe I'll say one more word about it. Let me get you back to the airline story. And let's ask again, what would have happened if instead of being angry, okay, we would have come to the airline desk in a perfectly rational state of mind, right? In a perfectly rational state of mind, we would have said, listen, we're perfectly rational, but still we request that you reroute us, and if you don't do it, we're going to sue you. Okay? This is ridiculous, because if you think about it, the effort, the time, the money that would involve suing the company compared to the potential benefit, the probabilistic benefit of winning the legal procedure and getting compensated, it just doesn't make sense from a rational point of view to do something like that. Okay? A mental state of anger allows us to transmit to the other party the fact that, in spite of the fact that from a rational point of view it doesn't make sense, I'm so pissed off about the way I'm dealt here that the entire thing of suing the company still seems appealing to me because I'm angry. This is something like saying, listen, I'm not rational, so don't expect me to behave rationally by avoiding to look, if you want, revenge for the way I'm treated here by this company. Okay, so one aspect for which we used experiment is the fact that emotion can be synthesized. The other aspect, which I'll talk a little bit later, is the fact, which is really necessary, the fact that we are capable of recognizing, at least to a certain degree, the mental state of other people. Because if we cannot do it, then there's no advantage of being angry. Right? Because if the other party cannot realize that I'm angry, it wouldn't affect the other party's behavior. It would be a waste of resources on my part. Okay? So before I tell you about these other experiments that we use to verify this aspect, let me first of all tell you a little bit about this part of the brain, which is called the prefrontal cortex, where we know today that is the part of the brain where most of the interaction between rationality and emotion is taking place. If you want, the type of decisions that involve the most intensive interaction between rationality and emotions are either social decisions or moral decisions. When we deliberate about a moral issue, it involves an emotional reaction. I mean, for instance, empathy is very crucial to be able to think about moral issues, but also reasoning and analysis is required. Right? When we think about moral issues, we have to do lots of comparisons. You think, is this case like this case? Would this person be doing right if he did this thing in this situation compared to that situation? There's a lot of analysis, and we know that when we get people under the fMRI, under the MRI scanner, to think about moral issues, the part of the brain that is highlighted the most, in which the consumption of oxygen is maximized, is this area of the brain which is called the prefrontal cortex. And this is also the area which this poor person that I told you about in Damascus book had his injury, and that's why he could do analysis pretty well, but he could not get connection between his rational deliberation or rational thinking and the drives and the emotional reaction that has to complement it to make correct decisions. Okay? What I want to do now is I want to say if you connect this emotional behavior. What's my time limit, Neil?
6:30.
6:30, okay. So maybe I'll skip, or maybe I'll go pretty quickly on this. I want to talk a little bit about altruistic behavior, about giving, and the way it connects to rationality, because this is one of the big riddles, one of the paradoxes for to some extent to economists, but also to evolutionary biologists. And as I told you, some of our people in the Rationality Center are evolutionary biologists, and I learned immensely from these people. Here is an example. One way to understand human giving behavior is to look at the animal world. And this is a startling example. These birds fly in big flocks, and the male basically, in a spontaneous, very spontaneously, take the role of guarding the flock, and because these flock make themselves victims of big predators like eagles that like to hunt them. One of them is flying above the flock, and whenever he encounters a big bird coming by, he screams very loudly. Whenever one of these birds are being eaten, it's most likely going to be him. Okay, so it's a really it's not only spending energy, it's also risking your life. And the question is why these birds are doing it. Here is another startling example about giving in the bird among birds. These birds are very common in the desert area in Israel, and in fact in the entire Syrian African Rift. And what you see happening with these birds is that when the male leaves the nest and starts seeking for food for his offspring, he gets back to his nest, but he doesn't put he gets back with a full mouth of food, but he doesn't put all of it in his own nest. He actually goes to the other nest and put a little bit of the food there as well. Okay? When the females sometimes have to go and help him with searching food, one other female in the flock would jump to her nest to warm the egg. Okay? It's really a kibbutz type of living, which is also quite startling. I'm going to give you some explanation very soon. One of the explanations is basically involve an idea which was simultaneously introduced into the literature by biologists and economists. And this is called the Handicap Principle. Okay? The Handicap Principle is due to a famous biology by the name of Amos Zahavi, who introduced this in the 70s, at pretty much the same time that Michael Spence, who got the Nobel Prize for the same idea, introduced the idea of signaling. And what Amos Zahavi was trying to explain is, why does the peacock have such a big tail? Biologists found out that it's only a burden. I mean, it makes things hard for him in terms of chasing food, escaping predators, breeding, whatever, okay? And Amos Zahavi said, this is precisely why it's advantageous. Because having this burden can serve as a signal to females, and eventually peacocks are only interested in females. They can signal with this big tail the fact that in spite of the burden, in spite of the handicap that this tail is introducing in their life, they're doing pretty well. Look at this tiny peacock over there. He has a tiny tail, and he's doing as well as I'm doing. This must mean that I have so many other traits that are compensating for this burden, and these traits are way more important than so much of this argument is about showing other people that I can do things that other people cannot do. And this is exactly the role of serving as a guard among these cockatoos. Okay, they risk their life, but they don't die necessarily. They sometimes go back to the flock, and when they do so, they actually get the best females, and this is recorded, right? Because they are able to say, I can afford it, okay? Human giving is to some extent like this. It's showing I can do it, okay? The other case is a different story. It's about inclusive fitness. It's about the fact that you are better off buying an insurance policy from an evolutionary point of view and support not only your direct offspring, but perhaps also your second nephew and your third nephew or your cousins. So if your own offsprings don't survive, you at least have transmitted your genetic profile or part of it to your more remote relative members, okay? Okay, in fact, this other thing kicks in a very interesting finding by Jim Andreoni, who is an economist who writes a lot about donation. And he finds, for instance, that donation in the US communities are very much dependent on the level of diversity. Okay? A 10 percentage point increase in ethnic diversity reduces donation by 14%. Okay, so if we go back to these birds, I mean, when they give to other nests, they don't give to somebody who genetically very different from them. And we ourselves prefer to give to a family member, even to a more remote family member than a stranger. And apparently, we prefer to give to our own ethnic group than giving it to other ethnic group. And when you look at these arguments, it all becomes quite rational. The Norwegian government once, several years ago, initiated a big initiative to market Scandinavian economy to other countries. And they recruited several economists, me among them, to consult with them how to do this. And there was a big, long discussions and meetings and conferences debating how it should be done. And one of the issues that I raised during these meetings is whether, and it is, you know, if you get to be in one of these Scandinavian countries, you'll see how different it is in terms of people, for instance, pay the highest tax rate in Norway and have the lowest in the entire world and have the lowest tax evasion in the entire world. Okay, these guys are actually enjoying paying taxes. Not only they enjoy pay taxes, they are extremely avert to exposing any financial superiority over their peers. This is phenomenal. This is outstanding. It's unbelievable. And my argument about this was basically I asked the question, is it really the set of rules that apply in Scandinavia, let's say in Norway, and does not apply in the US that makes the big difference in the economy? Or maybe the difference is the people behind these rules. Maybe it's not the rules, but the people behind these rules, the culture. And indeed, Norway and the other Scandinavian countries, before the big influx of immigration that started about 100 years ago, were extremely uniform in terms of ethnicity, right? Extremely homogeneous, right? These are countries that emerged from a very small number of tribes that grew into countries. And I believe that this is partly the reason why economic culture is so different there than in any other place. Okay, so if Neil allow me, I want to say just a few more words about this aspect of recognition of emotional state. And I'm going to start by showing you a short video of a TV game that was played here, that was ran here several years ago. I don't think it exists anymore, called Split or Steal. And this is a game in which there are two individuals that raise a lot of money together by solving trivia questions, and eventually they have to decide how to divide this money that they accumulated together. And they do it through a very simple game which will appear to you to be very similar to Prisoner's Dilemma. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we use these games to run experiments on emotional recognition.
Okay, this is serious life-changing money. Your jackpot today is £100,000, £150,000. One final decision to make. Easy decision. We're now going to play Split or Steal. I know you're the last two people in the country I have to explain this to, but you have two final golden balls. You each have a golden ball with the word split written inside. You each have a golden ball with the word steal written inside. You will make a conscious choice of choosing the split or the steal ball. If you both choose the split ball, you split today's jackpot of £100,150 and you go home with £50,075. If one of you splits and one of you steals, whoever chooses the steal ball will go home with £100,150. The person chooses the split ball goes home with nothing. If you both choose the steal ball, you go home with nothing. Okay. Before I ask you to choose, I want you to look at your two golden balls and make sure you know which is the split ball and which is the steal ball. This is very important. Make sure you don't show each other. Before I ask you to choose, I think you have some talking to do to each other.
Stephen, I just thought they weren't puppy dog tears and they were real tears and you were genuinely going to split that one.
I am going to split this. That's 50,000. I'm just going to, it's unbelievable. I'm very, Very happy.
There's no way I mean, everyone who knew me would just be disgusted if I stopped.
When people watch this, they're not going to believe it.
Please.
I can look you, Sarah, I can look you straight in the eye and tell you I'm going to split. I swear down to you, I'm going to split.
Oh my God.
This is serious. It is. Sarah, Steve, choose either the split or the
So I'm sorry, but I get signals from near that we are running out of time, so I'm going to skip it. No, you thought I'm doing. No. But before I show you the end of it, let me check your speculation about, let's start with him. How many of you think that he will choose split? How many think he'll choose steal? No. Let's split first. Steal?
I think he's going to steal.
How about her? How many think she's going to choose split? Steal?
We're going on with 50 grand each. I promise you that.
split or steal.
Tell you what we did with this. We collected, there are dozens of episodes like this that you can collect at YouTube. There's a similar game that have been run in the US called Friends and Foes. So we recruited students and asked them to make speculation, basically look at these 30 seconds in which they talk to each other. And based on the facial reaction, based on the cues, the body cues and whatever, make a guess about whether they choose split or steal. And they would be rewarded with money if they made the correct decision. Okay? If they make the correct, if they have the correct answer. However, we wanted to do two things. We wanted, first of all, to know whether people have the ability to do so. If they have the ability to do this by looking as a third party about other two people, they obviously have some ability to do that when they themselves interact with other people. But we wanted to test something else, and this is the effect of oxytocin on the ability to do something like this. Oxytocin is a wonderful hormone that is associated to the bonding between the mother and the child immediately after birth. We know that women are endowed with it when they breastfeed during their pregnancy. And about 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, economists started doing experiments by administrating this hormone. It is also used as a drug the other physiological function this hormone has is generating the contractions that are so important in the delivery. And often when women have a delayed delivery, it is used to induce the delivery and basically synthesize these contractions. And it's a very benign medicine, and people started doing experiments with this medicine. One of the things that economists found about it is that this hormone generates trust. How do we know that it generates trust? There is a famous game called the trust game. You take two individuals, you give some money to player one. He can keep the entire amount of money, let's say 100 pounds, or he can transfer part of it to player two. Whatever he transfers to player two will see 3 times this amount, okay? So if he transfer, let's say if he transfer tens, the player two will see 30. If it transfers 20, he will see 60 and so forth. If player one have full trust in player two, what should he do? He should transfer the entire 100. The other person will see 300. If he's fair enough, he will give him half of it back. Each of them will get 150. If he doesn't trust him at all, he should give nothing, because the other party is not compelled to giving back anything. Okay? What has been found is that those people who were administered the oxytocin, compared to those who took the placebo, and placebo contains basically all the elements in the medicine except the active one. It smells the same, it feels the same. People cannot tell the difference. Those who took the oxytocin trusted the other party much more than those who took the placebo. They transferred much greater amounts. Okay? And what we wanted to do is to, and this was published not long ago in the journal Psychological Science, which is an important journal in psychology. We wanted to see the effect of this drug on the ability to recognize intentions of other people. Okay? So we used two groups. Some got the oxytocin, some got the placebo, and they saw these videos. Okay? Okay? What do you think? Who do you think did better? So one thing we found is that those who got no medicine, or got the placebo basically, did much better than just guessing. And those who got the placebo, those who got the oxytocin did much worse. The way they did worse, was very interesting, is that they felt compelled to make a very fast decision. They were very averted to spend energy and thinking about these decisions, right? So they acted very quickly and eventually made decisions which weren't better than just guessing. Okay? And the reason why they felt avert to engage in this decision making is to do potentially with the role of this hormone in generating trust. Because if you think about it, when is it that we are asked or required to find or speculate about the intention of other people? Not when we trust them. When we trust them, we are not thinking about it. It's usually that when we think about it is when we suspect other people. Okay? And because this drug generates a higher level of trust, it's basically tells the brain, don't get yourself engaged or don't get yourself working in tasks that you suspect other people. Okay? Our brain is constantly active in lots of tasks, and once we are endowed with trust, we feel avert to spending energy and resources in trying to figure out the intentions of other people. Okay, you might ask yourself, well, why aren't we using it in all sorts of, when before we sign a contract, and you'd be surprised to know that there is a substance like this. I don't suggest you can buy it on the internet. I don't suggest you do it for two reasons. One of it is it can affect you yourself before it affects your counterpart. But the other reason is because you can buy it as over-the-counter in the US, probably the FDA approves it, which means that the content of oxytocin in this substance is almost zero. And wouldn't affect you. There are other ways to increase your level of oxytocin, and this is hugging. We know that hugging actually makes you raises the level of oxytocin temporarily, and this is probably why politicians tend to hug each other much more than normal people. If you look at TV, you'll see they always kiss and hug, as if there is a big love affair between politicians. And apparently they learn by themselves the advantages of raising the level of oxytocin in themselves and in other people. We're about now to do some more experiments, more in the context of competition, to understand better how this hormone can affect a situation in which we have to compete against each other. I think I'll stop here because I'm running out of time. If you have questions, I'll be glad to address them.
Thank you very much.